I'm Kathy Maxwell.
I'm Nathan Maxwell,
And welcome to the Good Faith Bible Study Podcast,
where we'll offer a few additional insights about the Bible study lessons from Good Faith Magazine.
Get the magazine and learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
This lesson, The Heavens and the Earth, is for January 5th, 2025, and the focal passage is Genesis 1:1 through 2:4. All right, so we want to start by recommending a couple of resources. Now, these are intended to supplement facilitators using Good Faith Media curriculum, but really anyone who's interested in studying Genesis more can benefit from them, and we'd encourage everyone to check them out. The first is Tremper Longman's How to Read Genesis. Now, the author, Tremper Longman, is an outstanding and well-recognized scholar. But what I like most about this book is that it strikes the best balance between being informed by scholarship, while at the same time being very readable and useful for studying or leading a study on the book of Genesis. And there's actually quite a few volumes in the How to Read series, and I'd encourage you to check them out. And the second recommendation is John Walton's The Lost World of Genesis 1, Ancient Cosmology and the Origins Debate. Now, the author, John Walton, has published quite a few volumes in this Lost World series, and as of this recording, there's still one to come out in the next few months. But this one in particular is focused on a literary and theological reading of Genesis 1. So the reason for choosing both of these texts, Longman's How to Read Genesis and Walton's Lost World of Genesis 1, is that many of the challenges we encounter when trying to get the most out of the biblical story of creation are related to context. We have, of course, a natural tendency to take our own frame of reference for granted when making sense of this or really any passage of Scripture. And so we understandably approach the biblical account of creation with questions and expectations that are really rooted in a contemporary, Western, rational, and philosophical point of view. But Genesis 1 has different roots, and it's focused on a different set of questions. We want a reasonable explanation for the universe, but Genesis 1 cares more about what sort of God made it and how things started out between us and that creator. The resources we have recommended do an amazing job of resituating Genesis 1 in its ancient Near Eastern context, which really brings the story to life and allows us to experience its full effect. Okay, so next we want to point out a couple of things that we didn't have a chance to mention in this week's lesson. The first is the Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. This Latin expression means creation out of nothing, and in this context it refers to the idea that stuff didn't exist, matter, space, time, that sort of thing, until God created the universe. There are a number of biblical passages that seem to take this view for granted. See, for example, Hebrews 3:11, Romans 4:17, and Revelation 4:11. But somewhat surprisingly, Genesis 1 isn't really interested in accounting for the state of affairs before God's creative activity begins. We just sort of drop in on a story already in progress. As God begins the work of creation, we are presented with a scene in which everything is a formless, empty blob, which God then commands into the world we call home. The crux of the issue is the very first clause, woodenly translated as, "At beginning, he created, God, the heavens and the earth." The NRSV translation brings out the subtle nuance of the missing definite article. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos. To be sure, Genesis 1 doesn't contradict the doctrine of ex nihilo. It's simply that the story doesn't go far enough back to solve the riddle, however honest the question may be. Even if Genesis 1 is quiet on ex nihilo, a Bible study on the passage is still a great opportunity to explore this important tenet of Christian faith. If you're a facilitator, consider asking your group, what existed before creation? After letting the discussion bloom, ask what Genesis 1 has to say about the matter. If your group discovers the gap, it's a wonderful opportunity to trace that belief through the rest of Scripture and Christian tradition. The second topic we want to address comes from verse 26. A careful reader is likely to stub a toe on the use of the first-person plural, "Let us make humankind in our image." Given how resolutely monotheistic the Old Testament is, the expression is surprising, to say the least. To whom does us refer? Tradition has usually equated the expression with the triune God of the Christian faith. The problem, however, is that, well, Moses wasn't exactly a stalwart Trinitarian. So interpreters have managed a number of explanations. The so-called mythological reading suggests that the creation account was borrowed from Israel's neighbors, but somehow a reference to the pagan pantheon slipped through. Of all the possibilities, a clumsy editor seems to be the hardest for anyone to swallow. Others have suggested that the Creator is not addressing other gods, but the heavenly host, something like the sons of God in Genesis 6 or the divine council in Psalm 82. Noting that the man is in fact formed out of the dust of the earth, a third option is that God is addressing the rest of creation that's been made so far. The fourth possibility is based on the fact that the Old Testament word for God is itself grammatically plural. The so-called plural of majesty option therefore treats the plural pronouns as a kind of respectful, formal style. A fifth option is dubbed the plural of deliberation. It's something like when you ask yourself, let's see, do I want a strawberry or a chocolate shake? As you consider the best choice, which is obviously chocolate, you are literally saying, let us see. Finally, interpreters have suggested something like a plurality within the Godhead. It's not quite a Trinitarian theology, but it gets the closest to how Christian tradition has regarded this verse. Proponents of this view point out the reference to the Spirit of God in verse 2, as well as the wisdom of God in Proverbs 8, who was formed at the very beginning when the world came to be. If we take into account a progressive revelation of God through Scripture, then it may not be too far-fetched to understand Genesis 1:26 as a kind of Trinitarian precursor, a nascent inkling of what this central doctrine of Christian faith would eventually become. There is so much more to explore in Genesis 1. We hope this week's lesson marks the beginning of an ongoing discovery of this incredible opener to the biblical story.
This podcast is produced by Good Faith Media. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
There, you can find a wealth of additional resources, including the 12-volume Nurturing Faith Commentary by longtime lesson writer Tony Cartledge.
It covers every text for every Sunday in the 3-year cycle of the Revised Common Lectionary.
Our podcast music comes from Pond 5. Check out the show notes for more information,
including a transcript and a few other tips for studying Scripture.